We're talking to Martin Ewart, who is General Manager of Logica Scotland, about the issues facing real organisations and real leaders. I know that you have a lot of experience as a leader and also a passion for thinking about leadership. What, in your view, given your experience and your knowledge about it, are the key issues in leadership at the moment?
I think leadership is an art or a science which is still quite immature across all large corporations. For me, there's two or three themes that are coming together for leaders of today that are actually quite simple, but need a lot of work to drive consistency through the organisation. So, for example, trust. How does a leader secure trust with their team and their extended organisation, and vice versa? How do they show that they trust the business as a whole themselves? Secondly, I think the uncertain times. We're in an unprecedented time of economic challenge across the globe. So how do leaders act when change is at a rate that has never been before, but it's got the complexity of uncertainty that has never been before? And I think those themes for leaders are really interesting. And I think if we can grow the toolkit to be strong leaders in that world, I think we'll be well placed to be leaders in any environment.
And you're talking with some authority about this because you have addressed those issues. So I'm going to ask you the $64 million question. How did you address those issues in a leadership role before?
Well, I would say addressing issues of such as trust and engaging colleagues in changing and uncertain times is something that I have done, and I've made many mistakes along the way.
We all have.
And I think, and to be honest, I think some of the learning I made when I got it wrong has made me more prepared to get it right. So for example, trust. Trust is an easy thing to say. Most leaders will talk about openness, integrity. They'll talk about wanting to win the hearts and the minds of colleagues. And I recall that, I would view myself as a value-based leader, so those sort of values are very dear to me as a man, let alone in my profession. But I also remember when I stood on a stage preaching around colleague trust and engagement. And then when I was asked around the operating model that we had developed, I was quite rigid in my answers. I took a position that, well, everything's up for grabs. I'm looking for your input on everything apart from this thing, which was really around flexible working and the use of sort of competence pools in the business at the time. On reflection, clearly my actions as a leader were not at all consistent with my messages around colleague collaboration. And actually, I realised some months later that I had got it wrong. One, I had got it wrong in the inconsistency of my words and actions there. But actually, on that particular example, the colleagues were right. What we hadn't created was a feeling of home, a feeling of belonging, because we had taken a much more flexible approach to resourcing. Actually, we ended up working together and got a much better solution for all parties. So I think as a leader, the key message I would say about trust is you can get acceptance from your colleague base to trust you at the start, but you have to be almost boringly consistent with your words and your actions to keep that trust in place. And it can be easily lost. And when you lose it, it can sometimes not be reversible, depending on how you've lost it. Now, at a time today when it's really difficult, things are tough out there, it is even harder as a leader to know you're doing the right things. And it can be quite daunting for a leader to say, I don't know. And therefore, it's even more important that you trust your colleague base to not give clarity where you don't have clarity. Be comfortable enough to say, I don't know, but also back that up with actions that engage with your customers or your colleague base to demist those issues where uncertainty exists in an organisation. I think honesty and integrity can be easily lost.
How do you know when you're getting it right?
The second example, Ian, is actually a much more challenging one to talk about because it didn't have a great outcome for the business concerned. But in terms of our actions as leaders, and in terms of my learning and the actions of our colleagues around that, I think it is a fantastic, perhaps my best example of getting things right, even in very challenging circumstances. I was chief executive of a business that, because of the group position, the funding was withdrawn. So despite the fact that we had money in the bank, we were hitting our numbers, we were looking in great shape, the rug was pulled from under us. And there was great uncertainty around the future of the business. Now, myself as both an individual and a leader and my team, all we wanted to do was hide away in a dark room for a week where we got our head around this complexity and try to bring some sharpness of what we're going to do about this back to the business. But of course, the colleagues sensed there were some challenges around. And I think it would have been exactly the wrong thing to do for us as leaders to go behind closed doors and not speak with our colleagues around this. And so we took what was deemed quite a risk at the time, and certainly wasn't fully supported by our shareholders, is we were open with our colleagues. We told them the problem. Our funding had been withdrawn. The future of the business was deeply uncertain. We also told them what we were going to do about it, the discussions we were having, the options we were considering. And we contracted with them around how often we would update them and what media we were going to use to speak with them. And as we went through this path that ended with the business going under, I'd have to say, we kept the integrity of the dialogue with our colleagues in place. We engaged the extended leadership team around evaluating the best options for the business. We asked individuals to keep doing the best they could for the business every day. It got to a stage where all of the colleagues weren't paid for a number of weeks. Despite this, not one colleague in this business didn't turn up for work. And perhaps one of my most proudest moments as a leader is I'm absolutely convinced, and I've had feedback to back it up, that respect, mutual respect, to and from the leadership team, to and from the colleagues, remained until the very end, even when we were locking the doors and people were made redundant.
I find that extraordinary, that people would show that degree of trust in an organisation. You seem to be saying that it's a two-way street. Is that true?
I think it has to be a two-way street. And it's actually the next stage of maturity, I think, for leaders. Because even when they start to match the consistency of their message and their actions, it has to go deeper than that. How do you do business? What are the business processes? I was speaking to a leadership colleague of mine recently, and they were sharing an example of a challenge of consistency in their business, which was that they wanted to win the hearts and the minds of a new colleague base, but they were instilling deep bureaucracy and checks around simple things such as expenses and travel and performance reviews. Now, I don't think those things match. You know, you can't say, trust us, but yet your actions aren't trusting to the colleagues. So bureaucracy and processes, which might actually be there with the right intent, can actually drive division with your colleagues, which is unintended and certainly doesn't portray a message of deep trust.
Martin, thank you very much for that compelling series of answers.
Pleasure.